The tornado risk returns to the Central Plains tonight, and over 10 million Americans are within risk zones. And on top of that, the Father's Day tornado risk is going to shift back to areas like central Illinois that have already been drilled by severe weather multiple times this month. The Rocky Mountains are going to kick off a new low pressure system while moisture continues to surge northward into areas like Kansas and Nebraska. An environment with decent shear and instability plus well-backed surface winds will be supportive of all hazards of severe weather, including large to very large hail, hurricane-force wind gusts, and the risk for a couple tornadoes. Tonight's event is not expected to be a major outbreak like we've seen recently, but numerous areas could experience damaging severe weather this weekend, including tornadoes. So I'm going to break down everything that you need to know so that you can stay weather aware this weekend and this Father's Day. So let's get right into the forecast. Really quickly, before we get into today's severe weather forecast, I wanted to point out the fire risk that's present throughout the Four Corners states. That's going to include near Phoenix, Albuquerque, Denver, Grand Junction, and almost all the way to Salt Lake City. So that's going to be for very quick winds as well as very low moisture. That's going to bring the risk for widespread fires. There's also a dry thunderstorm risk extending through Utah, Idaho, Nevada, and even into Oregon and Northern California. So that's going to be a concern as well, where you could have those dry microbursts that come through, producing significant wind damage in a short period of time. And number two, we do have a very significant flooding risk that is still ongoing along the Gulf Coast, including areas like Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And all that precipitation, the remnants of Tropical Cyclone Arthur, are going to continue to push off to the east. And that's going to be towards areas like Alabama, Georgia, the Florida Panhandle, and eventually towards the Carolinas. It's going to continue to bring that risk of flooding. And you can already see plenty of flash flood warning polygons on the map. There's also numerous flood watches in place. And some areas like southern Mississippi have already received well over 25 inches of rain. Widespread flooding is currently ongoing. So if you're in those areas, definitely make sure that you're staying safe with that. Do not try to drive through flooded roadways. It is never worth it. All right, jumping right into our Storm Prediction Center categorical outlook for the day. We do have a marginal 1 out of 5 risk extending all the way from Salt Lake City and down through the panhandles and even into Missouri. Out in Utah, we're going to be looking at the risk for some downbursts, but in our severe weather avocado is where we're looking at the potential for very large hail, hurricane force wind gusts, as well as the possibility for a couple of tornadoes. So we do have up to a 3 out of 5 enhanced risk throughout portions of Kansas, Colorado, and Nebraska. Looking at our tornado outlook for the day, we do have a 2% region stretching all the way from the panhandles through the Badlands of South Dakota. And then we have a 5% region outlined with a Sig 1 hatched region, and that's going to be where the risk is for a possible strong tornado. We're not expecting a lot of this, but the possibility for 1 or maybe 2 is definitely there, especially with initial convection as the supercell mode stays a little bit more discrete. So essentially, as you have those more isolated thunderstorms, that's where the risk for very large hail and a couple of tornadoes is going to be the most prevalent. Speaking of hail, here's the outlook for hail today. We do have that 30% region throughout western Kansas, as well as southwestern Nebraska, and even portions of easternmost Colorado. So that's going to be where the largest risk for large to very large hail is going to be. But in that hatched region that you can see here, which encompasses a much larger portion of the Central Plains, there is going to be the risk for large to very large hail there as well. It's just not going to be quite as confident. And then finally, looking at our wind risk for today, you can see out near Utah and Wyoming, we do have that wind risk associated with those downbursts. But then we also have the wind risk throughout the Central Plains, which is kind of the area we're expecting most of our severe weather today. That's going to be with a 30% region throughout Kansas and southern Nebraska, as well as a Sig 1 risk that is going to extend all the way from the panhandles through Nebraska and even towards Kansas City. That area is going to bring the biggest risk for potential hurricane force wind gusts. Jumping ahead to tomorrow's risk for severe weather, it is going to stretch all the way from almost the Ohio Valley back through the Central Plains, through Nebraska and Kansas and Colorado again, as well as all the way down to Oklahoma. But this is going to be a much more conditional risk dependent on the morning convection, as well as where those shortwave troughs are going to form, deepen, and where those frontal boundaries are going to set up. Our Father's Day tornado risk is going to be centered directly over my house in St. Louis. We do have a 2% region stretching all the way from Indiana down through Arkansas, Oklahoma, and southeast Kansas, with a Sig 1 risk for tornadoes stretching all the way through Missouri and southern Illinois, even into southwestern Indiana as well. Again, this is going to be a little bit more of a conditional risk that we're going to monitor over the next day or so. And tomorrow morning, we'll give another forecast update to give a much more detailed forecast on tomorrow's Father's Day setup. We do have a very widespread risk for wind damage tomorrow. That is going to stretch all the way from the Central Plains down through Portions of northern Texas and the panhandles, and then all the way into the Ohio Valley, even and into Kentucky. Our 15% risk for wind damage is going to be throughout Oklahoma, Kansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Indiana, and even portions of western Kentucky and Indiana as well. And then finally, we are expecting the risk for some large hail tomorrow. That's going to be out in the plains yet again, where we're going to have a lot of instability and more shear that's going to be supportive of hail versus any kind of a tornado threat necessarily. That being said, there is still going to be the risk for some hail stretching all the way back through St. Louis and Illinois and even into possibly southwestern Indiana. So that's going to be one to watch as well. Taking a look at the timing for today's severe weather, again, we are going to have all that precipitation throughout Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, even Arkansas, and into Alabama this afternoon. That's going to continue to push towards the east a little bit, and then we're going to have all this convection beginning to fire off in Alabama. So again, this flooding risk is very, very much still there, associated with the remnants of Tropical Storm Arthur along the Gulf Coast. That moisture is going to continue to push off even into Georgia in the Florida Panhandle, but areas like New Orleans and southern Mississippi are again still going to be hit with multiple rounds of rain today. And again, these areas have already experienced 25 inches of rain in some parts. So if you're in those areas, you've got to be staying vigilant. There's already so much widespread damage, and the risk there is very significant. Back in the Central Plains, however, is where we're going to be looking at that severe weather risk, as by 6 p.m. you can see isolated storms throughout portions of Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska, even Wyoming beginning to fire off. And these are going to be the ones that pose the initial risk for those large to very large hailstones, as well as some possible tornadoes. As we go forward in time, things grow a little bit more upscale by 8 or 9 p.m., where you may have clusters of thunderstorms or even a couple of discrete supercells still available around the map. At this point, the tornado risk is going to be a little bit more conditional. If you have any isolated storms, the risk is still going to very much be there. But if you don't have any isolated storms here by 9 p.m. and you have a kind of a cluster, it's going to shift to potentially more of a linear QLCS tornado threat, or it might be something along the lines of an embedded supercell threat. So essentially a supercell that's encompassed by a cluster of thunderstorms. It's a little bit messier. Those storms might be rain wrapped, so you need to be very careful as we get into the later evening hours tonight. And eventually by around 11 o'clock, things have shifted towards a much more clustery kind of mess of thunderstorms, all the way from Kansas through Nebraska and even into Iowa. Our risk for severe weather is still going to be centralized to Kansas and Nebraska here, but it's possible that we see a little bit of hail or anything like that closer to Kansas City or even into western portions of Iowa. I also wanted to mention that the tornado risk is not just going to disappear as we get into the nighttime hours here. We could see a couple of after sunset tornadoes spin up as well. Of course, the risk is going to decline a little bit during that time. This is where things are going to get a little less certain though, as we go into the overnight hours on Saturday, transitioning into Father's Day, which is this Sunday, as we are going to have this cluster of thunderstorms continue to push through Kansas, Iowa, northern Missouri, and Illinois. And where these thunderstorms begin to dissipate and how quickly they move is going to have a significant impact on the risk of tornadoes and severe weather throughout areas like southern Illinois and central Missouri. As we go through the afternoon here, you are going to see this cluster of thunderstorms start to push through central in southern Illinois, as well as eastern Missouri, areas like St. Louis. But the risk for tornadoes is going to come with the second round of severe weather that's going to begin to develop around maybe 4 to 6 p.m. on Sunday. So again, this is Father's Day. This is going to be a possible concern for a more robust tornado producing event than today's event. However, this is still conditional. It could completely fall apart by tomorrow. So ensure that you have notifications turned on for our forecast video tomorrow morning so that you don't miss it and you can stay safe with your fathers. As we push later into the evening on Sunday, you are going to see a more linear system begin to develop all the way from Oklahoma, where you could have some semi-discrete cells into the later evening hours, and then pushing all the way through southern Indiana and even into the Ohio Valley a little bit. By the time things become linear, that's going to bring the risk for more widespread wind damage and a little bit less of a risk for isolated, stronger tornadoes. However, the risk for embedded QLCS tornadoes is still going to be there. We will have this line by 1 a.m. on Monday, starting to push through Kentucky, the Virginias, and even into Pennsylvania. Taking a look at some of the upper level features in the atmosphere, this is not too high up. We are only at 925 millibars here, so not very high off the surface. I wanted to quickly show this low pressure system near Denver that's going to form off the Rockies and begin to push towards Kansas and Nebraska. Now, this is at 5 p.m. on Saturday. We're going to be looking at a lot of very quick winds and very warm winds that are backed at the surface. So essentially backed as in they're coming out of the southeast. So that's very good for storm inflow. And when you have better storm inflow, of course, you can get better air ingested more cleanly into these storms, and you can have more robust potential supercells. The last thing before we get into the meteorology behind today and tomorrow's event, I did want to just quickly point out how much rain is going to continue to fall throughout the plains and even into the Midwest. You're going to see all sorts of rainfall there, but also the continued risk for widespread flooding over the next 48 hours. Again, this is going to include Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, even into Georgia in the Florida Panhandle, and getting towards the Carolinas as we push later into early this coming week. But our main risk for flooding is going to continue throughout areas like New Orleans and even the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, where we've already seen significant amounts of rainfall. In terms of our upper level support, you are going to see that as we go through the day on Saturday, all this divergence is going to begin to form. And essentially what that means is we have faster winds at around 500 millibars. This is typically indicative and a promotion of instability and divergence that creates rising motion, essentially. So you need that for thunderstorm development. You're going to have pretty quick winds developing throughout western Kansas, the Nebraska Panhandle, eastern Colorado, even back into eastern Wyoming as well. One of the key factors in limiting the potential tornado risk today is that this is around 4 to 5 p.m. here on Saturday. We're showing LCL height. So essentially, at what height is the surface of the cloud base? This is where we're kind of seeing a potential limiting factor, as in the Nebraska Panhandle region, you do have some LCLs that are very low, which is very favorable for tornadoes. However, in Colorado and Kansas and even parts of southern Nebraska, these LCLs are a little bit more elevated, and that's going to make it a lot more difficult for a tornado to be able to connect all the way from the cloud surface down to the ground. Taking a look at our 0 to 3 kilometer storm relative helicity, this is just how much spin is available for the updrafts of a thunderstorm to be able to ingest. Anything that reaches yellow here is plenty sufficient. When you reach oranges and reds, you're looking at very favorable for supercells to potentially get going and rotate very strongly. So you can see by 4 p.m. here, around the time of storm initiation, we've got plenty of favorable storm relative helicity. And even as we go a little bit later into Nebraska and parts of Kansas, things are going to stay very favorable. So any supercells that can remain discrete by around 7 to 8 p.m. are going to have tons of spin available to them. And if they can ingest it and take advantage of that environment, we could look at the potential for a strong tornado. Again, we're not expecting widespread strong tornadoes, but the possibility for 1 or 2 to pop up is most certainly there with how much spin is available in the atmosphere. And that is kind of why today is a little bit more of a conditional tornado threat. One last thing I wanted to mention is our storm motion for today. And this is by 7 p.m. on Saturday. You can almost see these storms kind of revolving around this low. And the storm motion is pretty slow at this point. You can just see all these wind barbs going kind of right towards that low. So our storm motion is going to be a lot slower, and that's going to be another thing that's going to aid in things becoming a cluster and us having less of a risk for discrete supercells. But again, if we can get any discrete supercells, the environment will be there that could support a strong tornado or two. So definitely make sure that you're staying vigilant about that. And that's going to bring us to the end of today's forecast, but make sure that you have notifications turned on, as we may be broadcasting tonight, as well as we'll be dropping a forecast video tomorrow morning for the possible Father's Day tornado outbreak throughout Missouri and Illinois. Again, that's still very conditional, so we'll update you tomorrow morning so that you know what's coming, if anything is coming. But again, thank you for choosing WillBrattonWx as your source for trusted weather information, and we will see you soon.